It's an Archaeodeath interview with Professor Howard Williams and his guest.
Welcome everybody to yet another Archaeodeath interview with me, Professor Howard Williams, and my guest, Professor Karina Croucher from the University of Bradford. Hi, Karina.
Hi, Howard. Thanks for having me.
It's great to see you and to have a conversation with you. And you've been a generous contributor to various projects I've been involved in over the years, and including the last of our University of Chester student conferences where you gave, which was all digital due to COVID. So I feel like I'm familiar with you, but I'm sure there's loads of things I don't know, and my audience don't know about your research and your teaching. And so I wanted to just start off by asking you, could you just give a quick introduction to yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a professor in University of Bradford. I've always been interested in funerary archaeology. Actually, it started out with thinking about an archaeology of the body, where I was very much interested in the living body as well. And that kind of quickly moved into the realm of mortuary archaeology, just from a kind of practical evidence-based component. You know, we've got many more dead bodies to study, but I'm still interested in actually what death tells us about the living and the relationships between the living and the dead. And I guess I've tried to take a more theoretical approach to some of the material I deal with. Yeah, so yeah.
Yes, I mean, this is the thing that where we share a parallel interest in both what mortuary archaeology tells us about the past and what it tells us about us and how we can use it in the present. And so I hope we can explore those elements. But perhaps you could sketch a little bit more detail about the kind of research you've been doing sort of up until the recent times. You know, you started off working on the prehistory of the Near East, if that's the right term. Is that correct?
Yeah. So I started off indeed the prehistory of the Near East, what would now call Southwest Asia.
Southwest Asia, that's it.
In our kind of decolonizing journey. Very much thinking about materials such as plastered skulls, where people would bury the dead beneath the floor, you know, retrieve the skull sometime later and plaster it. And these had always been interpreted as evidence for ritual leaders and hierarchy, and placed into kind of social evolutionary frameworks. And I was kind of thinking that actually we're missing something here. What about the human element? Could this be something more about relationships between the living and the dead? And I was also really interested in how all of that can be relevant to people today, which started on my journey of a continuing bonds project, which was where I teamed up with colleagues in end-of-life care and nursing, a very unusual collaboration for an archaeologist, where we explored the use of funerary archaeology for getting people talking about death, dying, bereavement and loss, and challenging their biases. And I can tell you a bit more about that as we go along.
Yes, that's that. I mean, that's where I was hoping to really explore, but I would like to ask a question that comes to mind, because you started your data set looking at Southwest Asia, at these plastering skull practices. You know, I mean, I suppose I hadn't really thought about it this way before, but do you think that choice of whether you planned it this way, or, you know, that choice of material of dealing with the human skull and the post-mortem treatment of the skull and critiquing past ideas to build up a new approach, you know, really set you in, you know, inadvertently on this line to think about the sort of more intimate, emotional and caring relationships with the dead? Whereas perhaps if you'd started dealing with, I don't know, bog bodies, I don't know though, maybe not, because we know people that do bog bodies with those ideas too, but, or I don't know, just skeletal material where it's inhumed or cremated without post-mortem treatment. Do you think that would have perhaps made it more difficult for you to make that jump to thinking about the present?
Yes, possibly. It's really interesting because the kind of two are kind of very intertwined. So as soon as I started thinking about the present, it then set off all sorts of light bulbs about thinking about the past and about our interpretations of the past. So when I started working with my colleagues in end-of-life care and nursing, I started reading much more about bereavement theories today, and about how our understanding of bereavement and grieving has moved on. And this then got me thinking again about the archaeological material we're dealing with. But yeah, I see what you mean. If we've got those with the plastered skulls, we've got that evidence of the kind of tactile relationship with the dead, which is much more amenable to the idea of, say, continuing bonds and relationships between the living and the dead. So
well,
yeah,
I'm going to change my tack of questions because we're already into the continuing bonds. I was going to ask you about, perhaps we could reflect later on the broader ways that mortuary archaeology is interesting or relevant, but maybe we should just get into the continuing bonds project then. Tell us a little bit more about how you've worked with these other researchers to explore, mortuary archaeology in today's world.
So I'd always kind of been interested in making the past relevant today, and it kind of struck me that when, as an archaeologist, you might talk to someone on a train about what you do, and I realized that as soon as I started talking about the funerary archaeology side, the floodgates would often open. It would kind of release people to talk about things that can be quite taboo and difficult today. So death is universal. It's going to happen to all of us. We're all touched by it, and yet it can still be really challenging to talk about. And yet we know that if we have open conversations about death, it can help in advanced care planning. It can help for dying, and it can help the living too. Everything suggests we need to accept that death is a natural part of a life course and not a kind of failure. And so that kind of reframing and thinking about how, by thinking about death, we're actually celebrating life, and thinking that it's okay to celebrate life, and it's opening up those dialogues is really important. So what we did, I worked with Christina Fall, who is a professor of palliative medicine in Leicester, and Laura Green, who at the time was a colleague in nursing and end-of-life care at Bradford. She's now at University of Manchester. We kind of decided to try and explore the idea that funerary archaeology can be used to open up conversation a bit further. We ran a pilot project in Leicester, which was also involved Sarah Tarlow, where we literally put up banners around pubs and bars in Leicester that had different examples of funerary archaeology on them, and we kind of watched what happened. And we realized that people would very quickly move from looking at images of the plastered skulls or the Taj Mahal or ancient Egypt or wherever it was to they'd talk about how fascinating, how unusual the practices that we were dealing with were, and then that would start them talking about what they do today, and then very quickly it would move them into talking about their own expectations, fears, hopes, in a very natural way. And it was very apparent that the archaeology was used to give people permission to talk, to kind of as a gateway to opening up dialogue, in a way that if we'd gone up to those same people in the same bar on the Friday evening and said, would you like to talk about death, we'd have got a whole different response. But having the archaeology as a way in just let people talk. So we wanted to
No, but you were deliberately picking images of things that might be iconic or familiar from a world perspective, or at least a Eurasian perspective, or a North Africa maybe as well, or I don't know. But you were picking examples people might be able to, I've seen a picture of that. That's a Taj Mahal, or that's a Tutankhamun, but you were doing so outside of perhaps the paraphernalia of Victorian and later British funerary. You weren't lurking around cemeteries, you weren't lurking in undertakers or popping up in a hospital morgue. You were going to familiar commonplaces and trying to get their interest through sort of visuals of popular mortuary topics.
And then we also provided some stuff they wouldn't be familiar with, such as plastered skulls.
Oh, the plastered skulls, I suppose. Sorry, that's my bias. I forgot that not everyone's a plastered skull.
So that there was some familiar, but then some things that they were unlikely to have heard of before, which really provoked quite interesting responses. And that project was kind of where we got the idea that we wanted to test out this hypothesis more rigorously. Can we use funerary archaeology in this way? What benefit will it be? And also, what would the benefits be of working interdisciplinary research between archaeology and healthcare? Also, my colleague Christina was running workshops at the time, prompted by the Richard referred excavations in Leicester, which we also used as a bit of a springboard for getting people thinking about grief and bereavement, which was, again, quite a fascinating, that was one of the seed ideas behind the project.
So by Richard the Third, Leicester. So Leicester was not just an arbitrary Midlands city. It somehow spoke to the project in a more direct way based on the archaeological discoveries. That's fantastic.
Definitely. And it was it was quite a serendipitous way that I ended up working with Christina. I think you've heard me say this before, Howard, but so myself and Laura from Bradford, kind of, when I started working at Bradford, I went into health and nursing and said, I'm an archaeologist, does anyone want to talk to me about death? And Laura came forward and said, yes, I do. And then she persuaded me to go to the Palliative Care Congress. So I'm probably the first archaeologist to go to the Palliative Care Congress, which is just an amazing kind of experience. But I was sat at a B&B down the road talking to this woman at breakfast about my research, not knowing that she was the author of most of the textbooks on palliative medicine. And that's where the collaboration began.
Fantastic. B&Bs are underplayed and underrepresented in the story of archaeology and projects. And I think they need to be reinstituted, and foyers of hotels and random pub crawls, but also B&B, breakfast tables. That's fantastic.
And also the innocence of not knowing who people are, that gives you that freedom. If I'd known who she was, I probably would have been too terrified to speak to her, but I didn't have a clue because I wasn't from that field.
And that's an important point. I think we don't talk enough about the fear of communication in archaeology, and even if we maybe have multiple qualifications and used to discussing in a classroom where we know the parameters, doing something like a YouTube video is one kind of fear, but also just talking to strangers in the street can make me very nervous. And then you suddenly realise, oh gosh, they're actually interested, and there's a connection here, and it can go from horrible to good really quickly, or sometimes the other way around, but
And I think it's important for people, and especially students, realise that we're all people, and that even if we're a lecturer or senior lecturer or a professor, actually we're still people, we're still interested and are hopefully approachable.
Well, absolutely. And I'd like to hear a bit more about the results, because you've published already on this, and we'll just for viewers, all in the description, you can find all the links for all of Karina's research, her profile. We'll add everything about her bio and so on. But you've got the results. What did the results tell you about the potential of archaeology in these conversations?
So the results were quite overwhelming. So what we did in the actual Continuing Bonds project was we ran a series of workshops in Leicester and in Bradford with health and social care professionals and students. Many of them worked in hospices and in end-of-life care settings. So you would think that they would be already familiar with talking about death and dying, but actually we found that they were still affected by the same taboos often, even though they were in that setting. And the results were really overwhelming. We found that archaeology was indeed a kind of good facilitator. What we did in those workshops was we had one of our postdocs, Lindsay Booster, kind of developed lots of different materials that we showed people in the workshops. Often they were printed out laminates with pictures on the front and text on the back, and they were deliberately designed to be kind of incrementally provocative, or to take people out of their comfort zones. So we'd start off with something quite familiar and then move to something that was a bit more unusual or a bit more challenging. So we really got people to challenge what they thought of as right or normal through the materials.
Yeah.
And that was something that came out in results, was that archaeology was indeed a useful gateway subject. We felt that our model for success was creating a safe space in the workshop, providing materials which kind of had some kind of cognitive dissonance. It challenged what people thought of as right or normal. That, you know, led to discussion again in that same space, which then led to an actual change in people's thoughts and perspectives and approaches to death, dying and bereavement. And we followed up with our participants longitudinally, and many of them have given us testimonials about how being involved in the project changed their professional practice, about how they've taken it into discussions with patients that are dying. You know, some of our workshop themes, like how do you want to be remembered, or what do you want your legacy to be, have, you know, really then made a difference to how they interact with their patients.
So how does that go on? Sorry.
Which I was saying, as an archaeologist, it's quite moving to think that your work is actually impacting living people today and dying people today in that way.
Is the archaeology then a comfort because it shows the universality, or does it show the diversity of different ways, the options available? What is the point of the archaeology? Why couldn't you do that with, say, I'm only being devil's advocate,
Yeah.
why couldn't you do this with, say, you know, pictures of a 1930s gravestone, or a modern, you know, cemetery? Or
well, actually, that's a really good point. What we did was we did go broader than the archaeology, and we chose examples from throughout time, but we also chose some contemporary examples, and we chose material from across the world. And I think different people respond to different cues in different ways. And I think, you know, for many of the participants, you know, we chose archaeology because that's where we were coming from.
Yes.
But actually, there are different mediums that this can work in. A celebrity death will have the same response. A particular piece of music can again prompt those discussions. So it's not just archaeology that's able to do this, but archaeology fits into, you know, one of the tools that can be used. Yeah.
And do you see other benefits that archaeology can bring to sort of the care and of the professional, but also the people beyond those immediately facing death, and either as professionals or the dying themselves? Do you see this is there a broader way we can prepare people for death, do you think?
I think so. I think it just opens people's minds to the diversity of the ways that people deal with death across time and around the world. And so one of the things we were really mindful of is we wanted people to think about that diversity of practice and what that means, and about how they came to death and dying with their own biases and expectations, and seeing, you know, for instance, I'll give you an example from one of our workshops, which was we were looking at Capella de Ossos, the Chapel of the Bones that we often see in, say, Portugal and across Europe, where we've literally got these beautiful sculptures made out of human bones, which kind of the monks had exhumed and displayed. And our workshop participants were saying, you know, some of them thought it was beautiful and artistic. Others thought it was really disrespectful, that the body was taken apart, issues of consent weren't known, and, well, actually weren't gained because, you know, the people when they were buried didn't know that this was going to happen to their bodies. And then it was really interesting. One workshop participant was kind of quite affronted by this and thought it was really disrespectful how a body could be broken up. And then later in the conversation, she talked about how when she died, she wanted to be cremated and have her ashes scattered. And then that got her, you know, us to kind of prompting a bit more. Why is it okay to break apart the body after it's been cremated and scattered, but not break apart the body when it's bones. And she was like, I've got no idea what, and that kind of,
Yeah.
gets people thinking about why they've got their own beliefs and motivations. And I had another participant who had always thought she didn't care what happened to her body, but she realized that actually she did, and she wanted a green burial, and what she wanted wasn't a lot of pomp and ceremony.
Yes.
And, yeah.
So the archaeology wasn't to prompt inspiration for, oh, I'd like a big pyramid, please, or
No.
it's more about helping to put perspective and contrast onto the decisions they're trying to come to. That's fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely.
Although I bet there was at least one person who said, I want a big pyramid.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
So, I mean, I wonder whether did you have any dealings, because obviously many people in a secular multicultural society there's also have exposure to multiple faiths, and I wondered whether religious practitioners have been or could be a focus of dialogue too, or they were. I don't know.
Yeah, they were. We did have religious practitioners included in our audience.
Oh.
That was really fascinating. And again, it just like we had feedback that it helped them think about the diversity of practice, and again, to not come with it laden with what is necessarily right or wrong. But also the one thing that we realized was that while you think that faith might unite someone in their perspectives on death, actually it doesn't. And just because you're Christian, or just because you're Muslim, or Jewish, there's a diversity of individual preference and belief and perspective, and that there's not just one core, thing. Yeah, people bring their individual perspectives and experiences along.
I'm very interested in whether, I mean, it wasn't the focus of what you're doing, whether you accidentally encountered misinformation or and strategies of misuse or dialogues that misuse the archaeological dead, or is that not something that you focused on?
We didn't in the project, but since the more recent Graham Hancock
Netflix series, or
I can't remember what channel it's on. I haven't seen it, but my students have told me about it.
Yeah.
And since then, I've, when this has come up, I've heard people give a lot of that different interpretations of the archaeology have come across. But during the project itself, it didn't really come across in that way. I think there's been a shift since. People
at least understood that you were given, when you told them information about the Taj Mahal or Tutankhamun or plaster skulls, they took on board your dating, your explanations of what these might be, although you were leaving it open as a conversation, I suppose, about what they thought about it, but you weren't encountering emphatic, fundamentalist views that this is all created by everything's ancient aliens, or and everything was what do you think this means? How does this make you feel? What's your response to this material? So there weren't any right or wrong answers in that respect. And also we were quite open when archaeologists don't have the answers, and we were saying we think it might be this or it might be that, but what do you think? And we went on to develop some resources particularly aimed at counsellors and therapists, where we kind of took some of the bereavement theories and then more explicitly thought about some of the archaeological content through the bereavement theories, which was quite an interesting experiment as well. How much was there an interest in or an anxiety surrounding the actual fate of the remains, as opposed to finding the appropriate way of disposal and commemoration that would suit their families and their friends and themselves? I mean, how much was there sort of a fear of getting it wrong, as if there is? I mean, obviously, one level you're saying there is no right and wrong, but was there? Did you find a lot of people were concerned about errors?
Definitely. And in fact, one of our postdocs on the project, who's now a lecturer at Manchester Metropolitan, Jenny Days, has kind of taken forward this idea of death etiquette, and how there's lots of rules and expectations around death, and people are just constantly scared of doing the wrong thing. And we had some And what we also found is that people sharing their experiences of their own, sharing their own experiences was really beneficial in the group setting. So, for instance, we explored this in a project I've ended with Jennifer Days and Mel Giles, where we used the continuing bonds participant responses along with funerary archaeology more broadly to inspire kind of creative writing amongst kind of general audiences with often with very little experience of creative writing. Again, to build up resilience and open up dialogue around death and dying. And so one of the examples we found in that was, someone would say, so we had a participant story for continuing bonds that we've got permission to share, where this lady talked about having the last thing her mother had given her was a jar of Horlicks, and her mother had died, and then she'd kept this jar of Horlicks in her cupboard for 5 years, and it had gone hard, and and after 5 years she felt ready to let go of it. And then this kind of, when we shared that story, loads of people in the audience said, God, I thought I was really weird. I've got a pair of my dad's shoes or my partner's slippers or my mum's coat that I keep, or I've got this, I've got that. And it just kind of normalized things that people thought they were quite unusual for doing. They realized that actually it's okay, there is a framework for this.
So it created an opportunity for people to talk about the importance of material culture. What about places? Did you get more about people's attitudes to places too?
Yeah, absolutely. And interestingly, how place changes through time. So, there was one participant that talked about how, for a few years after their sister's death, they would travel to where her ashes were scattered on Christmas Day. But then a few years down the line, they decided to remember them from where they were rather than make that journey. And the significance of place kind of shifted in the importance of remembering someone. For other people, that was kind of almost flipped, where the place became much more prominent through time, which again highlights the nature of kind of individual experience in all of this.
Absolutely. And what about the traditional cemetery, crematoria, churchyard locations? Did they feature much, or were they relatively in the background of all this?
No, we did talk about graveyards, and we also talked about online memorialization and Facebook groups as well as a kind of different avenue. And indeed, in one of our follow-on projects, Dying to Talk, where we've co-produced resources with young people for young people based on the continuing bonds model, getting young people to talk about death, dying and bereavement. One of our young people on our project did a cemetery project where they were really interested in photography and created, lots of photographs of one of our prominent cemeteries here in Bradford, Undercliff Cemetery. So again, a young person in Bradford today was still inspired and impacted by a kind of monumental cemetery up the road.
Is it too early or to ask about what you feel the impact of the COVID pandemic and its various lockdowns has had on British attitudes to death, or is that perhaps too broad a question for your project?
Well, it's really interesting because we were doing the Dying to Talk project with young people during COVID.
Oh, of course.
We got funding. The project started in January. Well, I can't quite remember the timelines, but we ended up having to shift much of the project online. And so in some ways, I guess it made everything much more real and much more important because death was on the news every day, and yet it was still difficult. And I think it's kind of really raised with people the importance of being with the dead. I think when that option for many was removed, of sitting with their dying relatives, that has kind of actually reminded us how important human contact can be for many people.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, I mean, are there any other further ways you could perhaps I mean, is there any what I was going to ask is, to what extent mortuary archaeology is interesting to people or relevant to people? Is it something people can take or leave, or do you think archaeology, are we overplaying how important archaeology is in contemporary society for thinking about death? I mean, specifically mortuary archaeology. Do you think is it just a tool we can dip into, or is it? Do you think it does resonate in some other ways? I'm
I think
interested in your thoughts.
I think it depends on the individual. I think for
Okay.
some people, they kind of immediately, resonate with it. For other people, it's a kind of something to think about, but then they quickly move
Yeah.
on to
Well,
other things. And we definitely saw that in Dine to Talk project, which was, really inspiring. So some of the young people really stuck with the archaeology, and then others used it for a bit, but then quickly moved into writing a song or thinking about
yeah.
food, or and that
Yeah.
actually is still relevant too, because one of the things
Of
I'm
course.
thinking now is about identity and heritage and tangible and intangible heritage, and
Yeah.
actually the role that music and stories and food and dance can play in people's identities is really significant. So I see them kind of segueing quite nicely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. And where's your research going in future, do you think? Is that something you could share some hints for us with us? Or?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So I guess what the Continuing Bonds, Dine to Talk, creative dissemination projects have taught me is that how these are feeding into creative and non-medicalized approaches to well-being more broadly, and how we can use heritage and archaeology to tackle contemporary issues, um, through taking that non-medicalized route, through dialogue, through kind of social contexts. So some of the things I'm involved with now and going forward, place-based research, part of a People, Heritage and Place project, where we've worked with young people exploring their local area kind of through art and creative methods, to get them thinking about who they are, where they've come from, what they bring, thinking about cohesion today. That ties in with work we've done with refugee and host communities, where we've used heritage, both kind of digital heritage, and virtual reality, as well as intangible heritage, people's food, stories, crafts,
Yeah.
for cohesion and well-being amongst refugee and host communities. The digital heritage is kind of becoming more prominent as an additional tool to get people thinking about the role of heritage in life today and what it can bring. And I guess I'm also really interested in how the method we developed in Continuing Bonds can be used for other issues. So I've currently got a PhD student, Dulcie Newbury, who is using this for gender, and using archaeology around sex and gender in workshops with contemporary populations today, again to open up dialogue. I've got Aoife Sutton Butler, who is looking at preserved anatomical human remains again, and thinking about issues of socioeconomics and marginalisation of people in the past, what happened to their bodies, and again how these can be used for people today, and to bring light to some of those conversations. I've got a student that's starting using virtual reality and heritage for dementia care. And finally, I'm working with colleagues in psychology and health to think about how we can develop the method for getting people talking about food, diet, body image, eating disorders. So, it's moving from to try and tackle some, quite significant issues today.
This is fascinating. I must admit, I have encountered some of those issues from another perspective of trying to responsibly tackle issues of age, gender, appearance, disability.
Yeah.
On
Disability is another area we're working into. Yeah.
On social media, and trying to balance between the various misuses and rhetorics that surround these issues. And it's really I found it really quite shocking in a good way how invested people are in archaeological remains, and that misinformation can often be rhetorically very important and very good and constructive, whereas good information can be very corrosive if presented in
Misused, yeah.
Misused. So it's all about how we contextualize and engage communities with these stories. And I think there's fascinating areas, a whole set of research projects there that are going to really help understand mortuary archaeology in the present day and of the present day, if that's a fair way of saying it. How the past can be used in present day discussions, but also how it allows people to reflect on the importance of Ovaltine or Horlicks tins, or sorry, whatever it may be, and their own material world in these. That's fascinating. So where can folks find out about all this? We'll put all the links in the description, but perhaps you could give us a sort of an outline of.
Yeah, we've got the Continuing Bonds resources, which are at continuingbonds.live. We've got dyingtotalk.org, number 2, which is again a lot of resources we've developed for young people to use, and on both sets of you can download resources to use and kind of replicate versions of our project free of charge. So if you want to run creative writing workshops or some of our festivals of the dead, you can download some resources and instructions on how to do that. We've got our visualizing heritage, which you'll be able to find easily, which again kind of speaks to some of the digital heritage side of what we're doing and how that's working with communities, as well as some more traditional publications, which you'll put in the chat. I'm not sure what the correct technical word is for the blurb.
I'm just making it up as I go along. Thank you.
Okay.
But I do want to ask a final question, if you'll be willing to answer it. I mean, given that such a we haven't talked about your teaching, and I know how important teaching. You're not just a researcher. You are you not only do the teaching, but you research the teaching. And I wanted to ask you about your own background that makes you so passionate about your investment in teaching and in the type of mortuary archaeology research and your connection today. How did you get to be you? Because you're doing such distinctive stuff.
A really good question, and I'll probably just start with elaborating on what we're doing there. So I work very closely with Hannah Cobb, where we have been researching teaching, learning and archaeology for many years now, particularly with a focus on equality, diversity and inclusion, and how we want to break down the barriers between teaching and research and practice, and see that all of these things are kind of holistically linked, and we are, as archaeologists, do all of these things, and our students teach us as well as us teaching our students, and that discourse. And I very much came to that, a core motivation in my work with Hannah is about diversifying the discipline, and about making it more inclusive, making it a safe space. And so I came to it from quite an unusual career path. From Croydon, I did really terribly at my A levels. Well, I'll say that now. And I remember when I was applying to university the first time round, getting told my father was a window cleaner, and getting told not to put his profession on my UCAS form because no university would want me. And that kind of stuck with me. And indeed, I went for a first interview and I got kind of rejected from university. I carried on. At the time, I'd been supporting my A levels through working in Sainsbury's coffee shop. I'd gone on an English trip in my A levels to the Lake District, fallen in love with the Lake District, and so just went up there, got a job in a coffee shop, worked in catering, and 6 years later, lo and behold, the only experience I had was in catering. I knew I was wanted, and I was, ready for a change, but no one would give me a chance. No office would give me a job, even filing or answering the telephones. I was working at a service station, like on the M6, and I went to see a careers advisor, and they were like, well, give university a try. You're a mature student now. Many of them have got different recruitment strategies. And I was going to do something like European studies and business studies. And the careers advisor said, just do something you'll really enjoy. And I had a thought about it. And while I'd been traveling around quite a bit, and I'd always been drawn to archaeological sites wherever I was visiting. And I'd once heard about someone going to study archaeology, which when I was doing my A levels, I didn't really know was possible. So I thought, okay, I'll give archaeology a try. And, you know, Manchester University had a policy at a time of interviewing mature applicants. You know, I was 24, I wasn't that mature, but they gave me an interview, they gave me a chance, and, you know, let me in. And then, yeah, I just kind of haven't looked back from there, really. I think for me, a measure of success after doing my degree would have been being able to get a job in an office, or being able to get a job in a call center. That would have been fine for me. That's what I wanted, was the option of, you know, different career options. I never would have dreamed that I could have been a university lecturer or a professor. That was kind of beyond any realm of possibility. So, you know, I'm kind of very passionate about how transformative higher education can be, and about that opportunity needs to be much more open. So I guess that's what really drives me in much of what I do. Yeah.
I'm so glad I asked, and I didn't know all of that about you, Karina, and I think it's I think it's another way in which I hope that these videos, these interviews, get this story out, that what we do and where we come from are often quite intimately linked, and the way we approach our subjects, the questions we ask, and the way, you know. So I think you're an inspiration to so many, and it's really great that we were able to hear that perspective. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and I've just kind of encouraged people to just give it a go, and yeah, see where it takes you. If you're interested in something, just follow it.
Well, I don't really feel we should talk beyond that astounding point and just leave that hanging in people's brains, but I do want to thank you so much, Professor Croucher, for joining us in this conversation. And I think that this is hopefully will open up people who are perhaps new to your research to, you know, one-stop shop for some of the key links to all the different things you've been doing and are doing about mortuary archaeology and the human past, and its connections to today's world. So thank you so much.
That's all right. Thanks for having me.
Follow Archaeodeath on WordPress, or you'll never learn.